Further ado, I introduce you to Mike Matson from the Kansas Farm Bureau, who will be moderating our panel on the role of trade in sustainable livestock systems.
Susan, thank you, and thank you all for your attendance here today at this very important conversation. Again, my name is Mike Matson. I serve as Director of Industry Affairs and Development for Kansas Farm Bureau. We are a nonprofit family farmer rancher advocacy organization based right here in Manhattan, Kansas. We represent some 60,000 family farmers and ranchers who grow wheat, corn, soybeans, sorghum, cattle, and to a certain extent, hogs. It's a group that finds itself in the midst of some significant cultural change in this country. It's delightful work, and I'm honored to be here to moderate this panel of distinguished gentlemen who will talk to us about trade and sustainability. Let me introduce the panel, starting on my immediate left. First is Tom Vilsack. Tom is the president and CEO of the U.S. Dairy Export Council, maybe better known to Americans as U.S. Secretary of Agriculture under former President Barack Obama. Next to Tom is Marcelo Gonzalez from Paraguay. Marcelo is the Vice Minister of Livestock for the government of Paraguay.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next to Marcelo is, absolutely, thank you, Ma Shuang from China. He is with the China Association of Animal Science and Veterinary Medicine and the Beijing Boyar Communication Company. Thank you for joining us. Next to Ma Shuang is Jean-Philippe Dope, I believe who comes from France, but is here representing the World Health Organization for Animal Health, or OIE, as we're familiar with it with this audience. Welcome. And on my far left is Jason Hafmeister from the United States. Jason is the trade counsel for the current USDA Secretary, Sonny Perdue. Gentlemen, welcome to Kansas. Let's show them our welcome. Thank you. So we've got about an hour and a half. We're going to talk about trade and sustainability, and we will be done at 3 o'clock, if for no other reason. Moderator's prerogative. I have a 5 o'clock appointment at the Kansas State Fair, 2 hours south of here, so I'll need to hustle out of here. But let's frame up the conversation this way, gentlemen, and we'll start here with Tom, and then we'll move our way down. And we'd like each of you to respond to this question that frames up the conversation. Increasingly, consumers all over the planet care more and are paying more attention to where their food comes from. Governments will react to this demand in trade negotiations. So sort of a two-part question. Does this build in or bake in motivation for sustainability? And further, has this fundamentally changed the nature of the trade/sustainability conversation? Tom, we'll start with you.
Well, Mike, thanks very much. Thanks to everybody for the opportunity to be here today. I think it's fair to say that consumers are indeed more interested in knowing where their food comes from and how it's being produced. Unfortunately, I think that many times consumers are misinformed or don't have all of the information that they need to be able to make as informed a decision as I believe they want to make. So I think in terms of government's role and in terms of trade, I think first and foremost, the government has to sort of establish the rules of the road. And I think first and foremost, governments have to recognize that indeed the climate is changing and it is going to have an impact on how we produce, where we produce, what we produce, and how much we produce. I think that's a fundamental acknowledgement that needs to take place. And from that, I think a lot of policies are formulated. I think government has a responsibility of making sure that in addition to discussing this in trade, that it equips its producers to be able to respond to the challenge of sustainability. And that means creating systems and structures that invest and incent the kind of activity that will allow us to be more resilient, allow us to adapt and mitigate to the consequences of a changing climate, and as a result, be more sustainable. I think the government also has a responsibility, in addition to the food safety aspect that every government has, ensuring their citizens that the food they consume is safe, that there is a source and a method by which consumers can go, or a place that they can go to get trusted information. And I think it's, oftentimes I don't think government really understands all of its responsibilities in terms of providing the information that would allow consumers to be able to make the right choice. Because as consumers are making these choices, that in turn is going to dictate how you negotiate a particular trade agreement, because you're going to try to respond to the needs of your consumers. It would probably help if just today, if the five of us could agree on what sustainability actually means. We might find that there are 5 different definitions of that, and that's part of the problem.
Right.
That we define this differently depending upon our circumstances. I was in China just last week discussing with Chinese officials the opportunity for trade to provide assistance and help in the hog industry that has been decimated by African swine fever. I think part of a trading relationship is acknowledging the challenges that we each have, and certainly China is faced with a very serious problem in terms of its pork industry, and we think the dairy industry here in the U.S., for example, could provide permeate and other products that could help accelerate the growth of that industry and allow the Chinese industry to grow at a faster pace to reclaim some of the losses that they've incurred. That's part of trade discussions. That's part of a relationship that I think is important to establish. So if we have a common definition, if we have informed consumers, if we have the right policies incenting the right type of activity, then the ability to enter into trade agreements that reinforce sustainability become a bit easier. But if we have different definitions, if we have different expectations and acknowledgement of the challenges of a changing climate, if we have different government programs that incent certain activities but not consistently, and if we don't provide consumers accurate information, then I think it becomes really, really hard for government to do what it needs to do in this space. So that's kind of how I would start.
Give us the 2-sentence Tom Vilsack definition of sustainability.
Well, I think it has 3 aspects to it. I think there is an environmental sustainability, which I think all of us acknowledge. There is the social sustainability, which often gets into the area of animal welfare standards and things of that nature. But the one that's often forgot about is the economic sustainability aspect. You cannot actually have the environmental or the social unless it is economically sustainable. And if you create an inherent conflict between those 3 aspects of sustainability, you're not going to have as much success as you need to.
Fair enough. Marcelo Gonzalez, Vice Minister of Livestock for Paraguay. Same question. Consumer demand impact on trade, and how does that impact the sustainability conversation?
I will try to explain in Spanish.
Sure.
Okay. Cada vez que los consumidores eligen un producto,
Every time that consumers choose a product,
ellos están interesados en saber de dónde viene ese producto, cómo fue producido y por quién fue producido.
they are interested in knowing where is that product coming from, who produced that product, and how it was produced.
Y ahí es en donde se diferencian los países que copan mejores mercados porque tienen un enfoque del gobierno para transmitir eso al productor.
And that's why certain countries can differentiate themselves from other countries, because they have a better approach, because the government was able to recognize that situation.
Entonces, digamos que en esa parte de la sostenibilidad se construye analizando los diversos factores que pueden impactar en esta parte, como el factor económico, el factor social y también el factor ambiental.
And that's why sustainability should have different approaches too. So different factors that we need to consider. We need to consider the economic factor, the social factor, and the environmental factor.
Y ahí es en donde realmente en Paraguay los productores trabajan para poder tener estos factores alineados, tanto en la parte comercial, la parte industrial, y también que el consumidor sepa valorar esta parte del esfuerzo que hacen los productores para poder aplicar sostenibilidad a sus sistemas.
And that's why farmers in Paraguay take that into consideration, because they want to make sure that the consumer appreciates the way that they work and all the efforts they put into producing in a sustainable way, because that's very important for trade and for the industry, and everybody should be involved.
También, por último, en Paraguay estamos trabajando para poder darle un sello de calidad a nuestro producto, porque nosotros tenemos un producto que viene, el 95% de la carne producida en Paraguay viene de pasturas naturales y pasturas también implantadas. Y el 41% de nuestro territorio es una pastura bien manejada, y 41% del territorio significan los bosques naturales que se comparten en las propiedades de los productores.
And we're trying to work towards labeling all our products, because 95% of the meat we produce in Paraguay comes from natural pastures, and 41% of our territory has sustainable practices, because we work in a natural way, and that's what we want to promote. We want to be able to have a label to identify those products.
Thank you. Same question to Ma Shuang from China.
Okay. Thank you, Mike. It's my great honor to be invited to join this panel. So for the question, I think your question means the built-in motivation, I think, is really big of help to improve the sustainability. And I think the public concern should be encouraged by the government, and the government should keep the commitment to the consumers to provide the quality, the safety, the environmental friendly, and the safety food from the system. But I don't agree the government overuse this public concern as the barrier to block the normal trade, to eventually to protect the domestic industry. I think the government should advocate the concept of sustainability and implement some related measures on practice in the domestic industry. And the main task addressing the sustainability on trade should be done by the NGOs, by the roundtable groups or commercial companies. And they can set up the institutional criteria and ask their members and the suppliers to follow up very strictly. So after that, I think the consensus to the sustainability can be formed. And also it will be stimulate and drive the sustainability production system to growing bigger and bigger. And the consumers would like to pay more for the food coming from this system. So I think that's the practical way and the realistic method to build up the sustainable production system. And it's also good for the developing countries. For instance, in China nowadays, the livestock and poultry industry, they're during the transition period. So the supply of the animal source product is getting balanced initially on quantity. So after that, the government launched the supply side reform to eliminate the pollution capacity and encourage the animal farming relocation to the advanced area to go for the crop animal farming system. So I think all these things is good to build up the sustainable production system. And also on the trade side, in China, we not only input the final product, like the meat, like the dairy product, but also we input some grain, those materials, and the equipment and the technologies to optimize the total production system towards the sustainability. So I summarize, first thing, I think the public consent should be encouraged by the government, but the government cannot use this as the trade barrier. And second one is the NGOs, the roundtable groups or commercial companies. They should take the responsibility to imply the suspendability on trade. And third one, I think the developing countries, they need more time to upgrade their own system towards sustainability.
Jean-Philippe Daup, same question from OIE. Does consumer demand build in motivation for sustainability?
Thank you, Mike. From the OIE perspective, I have to say that it is legitimate and useful to know the origin of the products. In our domain, we call it the traceability of the products. And it's very important to avoid the dissemination of some transboundary diseases. I have to remind that the story of OIE started in 1924 with the invasion of Europe with the rinderpest virus in occasion of a trade operation. Buffalo coming from India and going to Brazil, who stopped in Europe and who brought with them the rinderpest virus. Since that time, the rinderpest has been eradicated thanks to science and the use of vaccination at a large scale. But traceability is a very important point to be efficient when it comes to animal diseases control. I would like to remind also that traceability started with some genetic improvement purposes to better manage husbandry. Then it came to sanitary purposes. And we saw, in particular in Europe, with the BSE crisis, which brought a better knowledge, better implementation of traceability, better regulations regarding traceability, identification of animals. And then it comes to other societal and environmental purposes. Animal welfare, for sure. Antimicrobial resistance. I don't know if tomorrow we will have some standards regarding trade involving some AMR concept, the way of we produce our food. But what I would like to add is that it's very important, and my colleague said it, to build consensus on the standards you want to have as a reference at a global and international level. We have two solutions. We can multiply the private standards and to have a kind of jungle of private standards, or we can work together within international organizations like OIE for animal health, IPPC for plant health, or Codex Alimentarius for processed products to build strong international standards, science-based international standards. Science is very important as a reference, and these standards could serve as a reference for the SPS, the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement of WTO. I mentioned the three domains of animal health, plant health, and processed products. We have reference organizations for each domain. We call them the Three Sisters, OIE for animal health, IPPC for plant health, and Codex Alimentarius for processed products. And your question gives me the opportunity to advocate for a strong international cooperation in these areas. United States is member of OIE. We have strong support from USDA, from various agencies. But the main support we have from this country is a science support. We have several collaborating centers. We have several reference laboratories involving the best experts to support the setting up process of our standards, not only in the US, but in many countries involving all our members. And having a strong science-based reference standards bring legitimate standards which can be used as a reference for example, for trade agreements. I was recently in Addis Ababa in Africa in occasion of a seminar on food safety organized by WTO, African Union, FAO, and WHO. And when we discussed the perspectives of the future global continental trade agreement for Africa, we had to mention that these standards will serve as a strong reference to facilitate not only the trade between African countries, but also the trade between Africa and other countries. The colleague of Paraguay mentioned the importance of trade for each country, and I'm sure that our standards serve as reference. And we have the delegate of Paraguay in the Council of OIE. When I say I'm sure, I'm really sure of that.
Fair enough. Thank you. Jason Hafmeister, Trade Counsel for U.S. Agriculture Secretary. Same question. The role of consumer demand motivating sustainability.
Yeah, let me try and pick up a couple of themes that some of the other panelists spoke about. I think, first of all, we need to recognize that trade is fundamental to achieving sustainability, environmental sustainability in particular, because trade at its very core is about competition, right? And allowing competition gives us the chance to increase productivity, efficiency, specialization. It allows extensive, temperate climate countries to produce more that can feed places that would be much less efficient and much dirtier in their production, for example. So we need trade if we are going to really have sustainable outcomes. But at its core, what competition brings is two sides to a coin. On the one side, competition encourages investment and innovation and increases productivity, results in greater wealth, which leads to resources that we can then use to promote virtues like sustainability that allows people to achieve their personal aspirations of a better life. So that's the good part about competition. It generates wealth. But on the flip side is that we're worried that competition can also lead people to make bad choices, that people will cut corners, they'll cut costs, they'll cheat at the marketplace, they'll ignore standards. So while we need trade, what we really worry about is how we manage that trade, what institutions exist so that we can promote the virtuous activity that can lead to real sustainable outcomes, but guard against unfairness, right, which is either just fraudulent or unsustainable or unclean production. So when you talk about how can we mold the institutions or the environment to promote these virtues of innovation, technology, productivity, I think the nexus really comes together on allowing people to exercise their preferences as consumers. I don't think that you can have a sustainable political solution if we try and cram standards down people's throats, right? I think we're much more likely to have sustainable outcomes where people are able to say, I value clean water, I value clean air, I value less pesticides, I value healthy animals, and they're able to exercise that in the marketplace. So when we set up institutions for trade, we need to set them up so they promote that kind of competition, where consumers can speak with their dollar and say, this is what I value, I'm willing to pay that extra margin to get it. And the challenge we have is that so often vested interests may try to hijack that conversation for their own personal gain. Let's define the standard so I'm the only one who can meet it. Let's define a standard so imported products cannot meet it. And so that's self-defeating in both ways. So I think when we talk about how can we make sustainability reflect consumer preferences and be bolstered by those consumer preferences, I think part of it is this institutional framework where we really talk about how do we promote competition on a level playing field.
Thank you all. Let's start the next round of questioning. The first panelist to respond will be Marcelo, and then we'll just keep moving on down that way. So when you think about population trends on the planet, and we all know what they are, we know the population trends. When you think about the coming population changes, is there a danger that sustainability will become a casualty of production efficiency? Marcelo, lead us off.
Tricky question, but nosotros creemos que la sostenibilidad es el camino.
We believe that sustainability is the road.
partiendo de ahí, esa sostenibilidad tiene que ir de la mano con la negociación.
And based on that, we think that sustainability should go hand in hand with negotiation.
Y el punto está en que tenemos que transparentar la forma de producción y que haya, como ya lo mencionó también acá uno de los panelistas, una forma, un concepto claro de lo que es sustentable.
And we have to be very transparent. We have to show what we're doing. And as one of the panelists mentioned before, we have to have a clear concept of what sustainability is.
Últimamente, los ataques que está teniendo el sector de la producción de carne, principalmente desde los grupos que están por alguna forma en contra de la producción, ha dificultado mucho el encontrar este concepto.
And the recent attacks by people who are against beef producers and the whole sector in general has created a lot of problems for us to be able to define what sustainability is.
Hoy por hoy cualquiera puede decir, como un caso reciente, en nuestras marcas de vehículos ya no vamos a usar el cuero del animal porque es como estar apoyando algo que no es sustentable.
And like recently we saw that some brands, some car companies said that they're going to stop using leather for their cars because we are not going to support an industry that is not sustainable.
Y no se dan cuenta que a quienes están afectando es justamente a los productores que están tratando de invertir en innovación, están tratando de invertir en tecnología para que su sistema de producción sea más sustentable y más amigable con el ambiente.
And they don't realize that they're actually hurting the farmer, the producer that is trying to invest in innovation and technology for them to be able to produce in a more sustainable way.
Y a lo que quiero llegar es que, por decir, el precio de la carne va asociado también al precio que puedan tener sus subproductos. Y la negociación del cuero era importante en el negocio y podemos hablar que en el Mercosur del 2015 se lograba $1.50 por kilo de cuero y hoy se está teniendo 15 centavos a lo máximo por kilo. Y eso es un impacto muy negativo en la negociación de todo el sistema que cubre el negocio de la carne.
And I have to mention that the price of beef was complemented by the price of leather at the time because that is a byproduct of producing cattle. So I want to mention that Mercosur used to pay $1.5 per kilogram of leather, and now we're only getting 15 cents. So that is something very negative for the industry in general. So we were trying to become more sustainable, but that's what we're getting into now.
Entonces realmente nosotros estamos invirtiendo en demostrar en la negociación que estamos también siendo sostenibles. Y en algún punto se tendría que tener un equilibrio y un concepto claro de lo que es sostenibilidad para que no lleguemos a tener que diferenciar lo que es la negociación y lo que es la sostenibilidad y podamos ponerlos los dos puntos en forma equilibrada.
And
Gracias.
we really need to invest more time and efforts into showing and spreading the message because we want to avoid that negative image that we have. So we have to put those two things together. We have to talk about sustainability and we also have to talk about investment and new technology for us to be able to have a clear concept about what sustainability is. So the negotiations and the talk about sustainability should be all done together.
Ma Shuang, the question surrounds global population trends, and given the fact that production will need to increase, is there a danger that sustainability will become a casualty of efficiency?
Yeah, my opinion is that the the food safety is the byproduct of the food security. So like AGP, used to be a revolutionary product in the past 70 years. It's really tremendously contributed to the animal production. But nowadays, we withdraw from them to the feed because we are awareness of the antimicrobial resistance. So I think for the developing countries, 80%, and for the developed countries, 100 years ago, we did the same thing. So sacrifice the environment for support, building up the production capacity and improving the efficiency. We really want to feed the growing population, and by what kind of we can do, so we did it. But finally, maybe the food security, this goal is approached, but we look at the whole system is imbalanced. So we find the environment, we find the food safety and the biodiversity, those issues is get worse. So we make the policy to make a rebalance. So that's the way we worked on in the past several years, or whatever the developing countries or developed countries. So I think it's the matter of the balance. Yeah. So and the balance makes the stable. So in China, our philosopher told us that we should go for the doctrine of the doctrine of the mean. It means that everything, all factors, it should at the proper position and connect each other to form the balance system. And this system is keep moving. So we must adjust all factors accordingly for the balance. Actually, it's a win-win situation. And that's the core value of the Chinese culture. So I think it's a highly possibility. I think the sustainability could be the category of efficiency, but we can mitigate it or totally avoid by respect and understanding each other and support each other and move together. And sometimes we compromise to the mutual goal. And by this way, I think to make the balance in between the sustainability and the efficiency.
Jean-Philippe, what about that? Can we find a balance between sustainability and increased production efficiency?
Yes, I think sustainability first is let's say a positive concept or politically correct concept. And we have to implement it because it's also an expectation of our citizens, our politicians, many stakeholders. And animal health is also a part of sustainability and food security. I would like to quote one figure. Animal diseases can originate 20% of losses of animal production at global level. So sustainability is also investing in this kind of things to have a better control on these diseases, which finally affect sustainability and the production. I heard the Spanish delegate saying that we have to invest in animal health to have a good economy and to promote trade, but we have also to have a good trade and a good economy to invest in animal health. This is a cycle. What happens also is that sometimes there is a contradiction between the expectations of consumers and citizens, which imagine sustainability with nice animals grazing in large green lands, being happy, enjoying the place. And if I remember what was said today and yesterday by many experts, researchers, they mentioned that we have a better sustainability if perhaps we are able to intensify our systems, our food systems. So there is an ambivalence, a contradiction between some expectations, and we have to manage that. A colleague was saying to me that what the consumers don't like is the extremes. To have very intensive on one side and let's say very organic on the other side. And finally, we have to find the compromise. My colleague from China just said it. The solution is a compromise, and a compromise based on science, very solid evidence. And I repeat again that science is part of the solution. We have to invest in science. We have to invest in precise agriculture, precise husbandry, and doing that, we'll be able to build this consensus and to build this compromise. But we have to explain. Science is not always easy to understand for every citizen. Genetics, animal health, management of animal production sometimes mean very difficult concepts to understand. And we have to invest also in advocacy, in communication, in order to better explain what are the solutions.
Jason Heffmeister, American livestock producers have shown clear efficiencies in their production models. Is there a danger that sustainability might go by the wayside as a result of these practices?
Yeah, well, first, I think we have to increase productivity. More output per unit of input is essential for sustainability. Given growing populations, growing wealth, we just have to produce more on less. So I think they're entwined. And so the question really is, how can we encourage that productivity? And there's some great stories out there about new technologies, about production technologies, about production techniques, about innovative genetic activity. All these things have great potential to improve this productivity, and that should all be enhancing sustainability as we're making more off of less. I think the risk that we run is maybe twofold. One is if we have this productivity driven by something other than consumer preferences, right? I think I'm very concerned when we in Washington are determining small-scale decisions, personal decisions. We get captured by special interests, and after that, so I'm much more confident if we can set up an open system where producers are listening to their customers and they're being judged in the marketplace over what their customers value. Failing that, we run into systems where we subsidize inputs instead of encouraging virtuous outcomes. We have price supports, we give input subsidies, we give away seed and fertilizer and fuel. So I think definitely we got to bring it back to the consumers and put them in a position where they can value the production and the productivity enhancements that our producers are doing.
Thank you. Tom, last one on this question.
Jason, I wish I lived in your world. I don't think I do live in your world, because I'm not sure that we can empower our consumers to give us the right set of signals unless we are providing consumers with the information they need to make informed choices. So I think there is a role for government to help the consumer understand. I remember being in the Secretary's office one day when a gentleman came into my office and wanted to place a label on products that he was producing, and he wanted to place the label that his products were more organic. And I said, well, that's interesting. I said, tell me how it is that you're more organic. And the example he used was that his competition, an organic producer, used a rototiller, and he used a hand tool. And he wanted to be able to market his product as being more organic. Good. The challenge we have, especially with social media, is that the definition of sustainability by consumers is constantly changing because the marketplace is always looking for the marketing advantage. And that's why we now have negative advertising and negative marketing. When you see milk bottles that say no antibiotics, and the reality is that antibiotics are not supposed to be in the milk supply, or non-GMO, or we see gluten-free on stuff that isn't remotely connected to gluten. So I think the efficiency here is making sure that there is some consistency and some informed decision-making that's being made by the marketplace. Secondly, there is a tremendous pressure on producers because they get hit from the consumer side. They also get hit from the retail side, where large retail organizations are dictating what they believe the market is or what they believe will provide them a marketing advantage. So I think, the challenge here is that balance, right? I agree with you, we don't want government dictating all of this, but I think government does have a role in making sure that consumers are well informed and send the right set of signals in the market. That's why science is important. I certainly agree with my colleagues who suggest that we need to have a science-based system because to a certain extent, the science-based system is a system that's gone through a degree of rigor where there is at least a consensus. Obviously, that consensus can change with time because science is never totally fixed, but it does provide a consensus-driven process, which I think is important. Let me add one other element of this efficiency discussion, and that is we can become efficient and also productive and also provide revenue for producers and maintain a cost of food that doesn't price low-income people out of being able to have access by essentially creating an agricultural system that replicates nature. If you think about it, there is no such thing as waste in nature. Nature figures out a way to use everything. I think we're on the cusp, at least within U.S. agriculture, and I think I can speak for the dairy industry, we're on the cusp of trying to figure out how do we create a wasteless system, a system that doesn't create waste. The waste that is produced by a dairy operation, how do you convert that into a variety of different chemicals and materials and fabrics and fibers in a way that essentially reduces emissions from that operation, creates new revenue streams for farmers, and essentially creates an incredibly more efficient system. And how do we then provide that technology, those techniques globally shared so that we are essentially all in this process of trying to figure out how to duplicate or replicate nature. I think we can get to a net zero emission agriculture. I think we can get to significantly reducing waste in agriculture. And in doing that, we become more efficient, we become more sustainable, we become more profitable, and we create new opportunities for producers. And I think we can keep food affordable. One of the challenges I think we're all going to face with this issue of sustainability is how you maintain the cost of food at a rate that all can afford, and that you're not pricing people or creating divisions within populations between the haves and have-nots in terms of access to decent food and good food.
We'll start our third round with Ma Xuang, and we touched on this a little bit in response to the first question, but let's drill into it a little bit here with this one. By definition, the notion of trade implies a mutually beneficial business deal. I have a product to sell, you want to buy it. The goal of sustainable livestock systems must account for factors beyond that pure financial transaction. Things like economic factors, cultural and social factors, environmental factors. How do you prioritize those factors? Again, we'll start with Ma Xuang.
Yeah. I think the sequence should be the culture and the economic, and after that the environmental environment. I think the culture will fundamentally define determines the driving force and the opportunity to set up the sustainability production system. I use China as an example again. It's according to our culture that the mankind should live in harmony with nature. So the Chinese, they creates the recycling agriculture farming to feed the largest population in the world for 1,000 years. And the Dr. Franklin King is the former USDA officer, and 100 years ago he investigated in China, in Korea, and Japan, and to investigate the sustainability agriculture system that he calls. So after that, he introduced this system back to the USA and make the localization, and it works till now in the US. So I saw many Chinese, they come to US to learn it. So I tell them that, okay, and you can learn. It's already localization in the US, but it's really learned from in China. So it's the time for us to learn from our ancestor, to build up our system toward sustainability. And second, from the Chinese culture is also way back to the balance, this philosophy itself, that it reflects to the eating habit is to make the balanced nutrition on the vegetable meat mixed that. So that's why the Chinese government suggests the consumers to eat less red meat for health. So I think it's fundamentally set up the Chinese people can accept the concept of sustainability, which is very important. And for the second one, I think is the economic. I think the economic is determine the quantity and the quality of the commodities we trade, and also determine the capability to maintain the sustainability protection. So I think the culture is on the mentally, and for the economic is on the physically to make the system growing toward the sustainability. And then environment is a kind of consequence.
Jean-Philippe Dope, think about those factors that impact global sustainable livestock systems. Economic factors, social, cultural factors, environmental factors. When you think of that from the perspective of trade, how do you prioritize those?
I think you could have mentioned another factor which is very important for us, which is food safety, which is a factor which can drive the economy of the sector. We have currently the example of African swine fever in Asia, but not only in Asia, in Europe, in some parts of Europe. Today, there is a standing group of experts from GFTAS. GFTAS is a global framework for the progressive control of transboundary diseases. It's a joint initiative with FAO, which aim is to better control these transboundary diseases like African swine fever, which have a strong impact in the livestock economy. Just a few figures. Already 5 million porks, swines have been slaughtered and died because they were contaminated by this virus for which we have no vaccine solutions. The only solution is to implement a very good biosecurity measures, and there is a need to share information, to be transparent in order to ensure a fair and safe trade. We have already 45 countries contaminated by this disease. Only in August, we have 18 countries who notified cases to the World Organization for Animal Health. So this is a strong concern. Yesterday, we learned that the Philippines was a new country touched by African swine disease. Philippines are at the 8th rank for pork production and at the 10th for pork consumption. So it is not a small issue. We already talked about BSE. Perhaps BSE is, unfortunately, is an old story for for the countries who had to know this disease. And this gives me the opportunity to insist on the capacity of good science to reduce, not only to control this kind of disease, but also to reduce the waste. If you remember, to control the disease, we have to burn a lot of quantities of animal production, what we call the SRM, the specific risk materials. But if we implement good processes, for example, to treat byproducts, we can produce safe fat, we can produce safe gelatin, which will feed also the world. So again, science is part of the solution, and I think that my colleagues say the same thing. I was very interested regarding what you said, Mr. Ma, regarding the culture impact. This is a very important point, and working in international intergovernmental organization, having 52 nationalities in its staff, it is a daily concern. We have to keep in mind that when a country, a single member says something, it is not necessarily the vision of all the members and all the countries. We have not one vision, we have several visions, and our task is to bring consensus and to find a compromise. And I will take another example, which is animal welfare and religious slaughter. You know, in some countries it's a very sensitive topic, but for others it's a very important point, and economy is it can have very important impact for economy in several parts of the world. If you look at the exports of Ethiopia, Kenya, and some other countries of the Horn of Africa to the Arabic Peninsula, you will find that not only animal health, but the way the traders implement animal welfare and implement religious slaughter on destination is a very important point. Is the reason why, after having developed some animal welfare animal welfare standards, the solution was not to stop religious slaughter, but to share good practices and to set up a compromise for that. And after having adopted these standards, the objective is now to promote a good implementation of these standards. Because one thing is to adopt standards, another thing is to implement them. And I want to mention a very important project for us, which is in progress. We are at the design phase with the support of ILRI. We call this project BEST, Better Enforcement of Standards for Safer Trade. And it's an interregional project between the Horn of Africa and the Arabic Peninsula, which objective is to help the exporters and the importers to know better the OIE standards for animal health, for animal welfare, including religious slaughter, to securize this trade, which is very important for the incomes and for the livelihoods of many farmers in the Horn of Africa. And I have to say that we have some support also from the importing countries to progress and to support a better implementation of our standards. So culture and science are two important factors which can improve the situation of trade and which can bring to a safer trade. I like very much this morning the one sentence of Professor Featherstone who said that, I quote him, sustainability is a journey rather than a destination. I totally agree, and I would paraphrase this sentence saying that sustainable and safe trade is a continuous journey and a continuous challenge rather than a destination.
Thank you. Jason, thoughts on prioritizing societal factors in this conversation?
Yeah, I think about the challenges of doing this. You know, this is a consistent challenge we have in government. How do we promote virtuous activity without interfering with fair competition? And so you got to define, well, what's virtuous, who decides, and then what's the most effective way to try and promote that. And so I think the contrast with health and safety standards is a good one, because it's much easier for us to come to consensus on what is necessary to guard against diseases and pests. And that can concentrate the mind and can develop a consensus about, okay, that we are not going to import dangerous things, we are going to ban this kind of practice. I think in sustainability, the first challenge of how do we define what's virtuous is we've got a long way to go to get consensus there. So we got to invest in that. We've got to help establish in people's minds what we want to promote and what not. I would like to see that executed through consumer preferences, but certainly in some cases governments may have to step in as well, not just defining the standards, but helping set up this fair playing field. And then I think that's the second question. Once we define what's virtuous, which I think we have a long way to go, then you have two basic tools, right? We can ban stuff, which is dangerous because that has the huge deadweight loss on consumers when we take choices away from them, or we can subsidize things, which can also be dangerous if we encourage the wrong kind of behavior. I've seen my own experience, I'm much more encouraged by the subsidy side, where we identify a virtuous practice and we compensate someone for the additional cost of undertaking that practice so that it brings them back to some sort of level with their other competitors. But then that rewards them in a way that maybe the market is not ready yet to do. I think that's a much cleaner way to go about that. We've experimented with a few programs in different forms through our farm bills. And so that's the way I would try and tend people to go when they come into my office. I say, give me a pro-competitive solution. Give me something that we can put on the marketplace and let consumers decide, but allows you at least to have your day in the marketplace.
Thank you. Tom?
Well, I wish we could prioritize these three, because it would make our jobs a lot easier. I'm not sure how you do that. You can say that environment ought to be maybe second or third, but I think about the avian influenza situation we confronted when I was secretary, which was in essence a reaction to a warming climate. Migrating birds spent more time than they normally do in the upper Midwest, and the next thing you know, a significant percentage of our egg-laying hens gone, turkey gone, because of the environmental situation. I think the social, you can say, well, maybe we can put that down at the bottom, but then you've got a circumstance and situation where if someone does not treat animals properly, that's then used by others to say, well, we're not going to buy from you because you're not taking care of your animals. And then we can say that economics may not matter, but the reality is we can either make food so costly that hardly anybody can afford it, or we could put so much of a burden on the producer that we'll have fewer producers. So to me, I think the challenge for us globally and for each nation is essentially how do you create and design a system that doesn't prioritize those three, that figures out how you balance them. So in the dairy industry, there's a recognition of the important role social plays by a standard for animal welfare called the Farm Program, Farmers Assuring Responsible Management. That has gone through several iterations. As we learn more, that's constantly changing to the point that this is a continuous journey. Indeed, it is. I think we're learning more about the impact of climate, the diseases and pests that are liable to arise, and we need, as a globe, to be more interested in bioterrorism or the bioattacks and having in some place, like Kansas State or someplace, enough vaccine to be able to deal with these issues as they come up, so we don't decimate 20% or 30% or 50% of a particular industry. So I really think we need to challenge ourselves as a global community. I think the international institutions need to be challenged as well. And I think trade negotiators, as they're negotiating these trade agreements, there has to be some thought to how do you balance these three to make sure that whatever trade agreement you enter into sort of reinforces the notion of a balance. Because I think if you start prioritizing these, I think you're going to end up prioritizing in the wrong order, and you're going to end up having some serious problems.
Marcelo, final thoughts on this question.
Nosotros desde el gobierno paraguayo consideramos que los tres factores tienen que ser tenidos en cuenta de forma equitativa, porque consideramos que queremos ir hacia un comercio sustentable en el tiempo y una producción sustentable en el tiempo.
Well, in Paraguay, our government thinks that the three of them should go and should be treated equally, because we think that we have to increase our production in a sustainable way and trade should grow the same way.
Somos conscientes que el factor económico, la parte económica, es la que tiene mayor tiempo andado, porque es la forma tradicional de comercializar.
And we think that the economic factor is the one that has lasted longer because that's the way that we have been trading so far.
Pero también la parte social y la parte ambiental, últimamente lo estamos tratando de incorporar dentro de las conversaciones, porque realmente en este momento en el país estamos entendiendo que cuando los sectores productivos no funcionan como se espera, la economía repercute principalmente en las fuentes de trabajo que da el sector productivo y también en el flujo de la parte comercial que hay dentro del país.
And we're trying to include the social aspect of it and then the environmental aspect too in our negotiations and all our conversations, because we understand that everything that has to do with the economy also affects the regular individual. So we have to see everything as a whole.
Como somos un país mediterráneo, tenemos mayores costos a la hora de sacar nuestros productos del país.
Since we have no coastal line, so it's more costly for us to be able to ship our products.
Y la parte de producción de carne es responsable por el 11% del GDP del país.
And beef production is responsible of the 11% of our GDP.
Esto nos lleva a analizar el porcentaje de divisas, son 1.400 millones de dólares que entran al país por la exportación de 65% de nuestra producción.
And we also pay close attention to the numbers, because $1.4 billion is what we get for our 65% exports of beef.
Hoy estamos trabajando en un sistema de trazabilidad que incluye información ambiental, información social, información del mantenimiento de los bosques y los recursos naturales, el aprovechamiento del agua, que en Paraguay en gran parte se aprovecha el agua de lluvia, y también ofrecer toda esta plataforma para que nuestra carne tenga mayor valor en el extranjero.
And now we're working towards a traceability program, because we want to make sure that we are covered regarding the environment, our social efforts, and we want to take care of our forests. And we have a water management program, because most of our water for irrigation or for any type of use is rainwater. So we're going to create a platform so our beef will have higher value in the market.
Y también estamos trabajando en que los mercados que llevan nuestra carne tengan en cuenta si en el país se está dando una distribución equitativa del pago. Si va al productor lo correspondiente, si va también entrando legalmente al fisco lo que corresponde, y si también el efecto social se puede ver en los negocios que están adyacentes a la ganadería.
And also we try to keep track of everybody that's involved in the market, because we want to pay close attention to every single farmer and every single producer, for everybody to be part of a fair trade, because we want to also be responsible regarding our social impact. And the government is really careful about that, so everybody should be compensated for what they do.
Y por último, la comunicación eficiente del gobierno y de la sociedad en una asociación público-privada es el camino que nos va a llevar a poner estos tres factores en una situación equilibrada y útil para la humanidad.
And lastly, the government is trying to create an open communication with our society, for the society to be involved in everything that has to do with trade as well, because in that way we're going to have a good balance between the three of them, and everybody will benefit, and also humankind will benefit from this.
Thank you. Last question for the panel before we go to audience Q&A, and we'll start this one with Jean-Philippe Doe. Think about the barriers that exist between financially driven trade transactions and sustainability. What are they? We've talked about some of them, but probably the more important question is, how can they be overcome?
I think the response is not only in finance, but also I repeat, in science, in techniques, and the way we support the countries. If I come back to the effect on climate change, on animal diseases, Mr. Vilsack mentioned the impact on avian influenza, but we have also a strong impact on what we call the vector-borne diseases, lumpy skin disease, Rift Valley fever. So it's also important to work on the vectors, for example. And we have a very good reference center in Kenya doing that, the ICP, which is a well-known research center on insects. So we have to consider this global warming to have good orientations in terms of research and expertise. The faculty to support our members, what we call capacity building, and to remain in the field of animal diseases and veterinary services. I would mention our pathway, which is called the Performance of Veterinary Services pathway, which starts from a voluntary audit of the veterinary services and which ends to supporting activities, for example, to set up very good legislation aligned with OIE international standards. We have some challenges for the future, and I would mention transparency, which is very important when we are talking about transboundary diseases. We have to know where the disease starts to avoid their dissemination, to put in place good control measures. It's the reason why we invest in the modernization of the World Animal Health Information System to make it more friendly, more efficient, more digital. Digitalization is also part of the solution and another challenge. We had the pleasure to listen to a very interesting panel this morning regarding innovation, and I totally agree with the representative of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Mr. Austin, who highlighted the importance of digitalization, the importance of good data management, good data stewardship. We have many data all around the world regarding animal population, regarding climate, regarding movements of populations. And the difficulty we have is to connect all these data to better analyze the situation and to better imagine the solutions for the future. And this is not only true for animal health, it's true for genetics, it's true for the improvement of husbandry management. So we have to invest, I repeat, in sustainability. We have to invest in animal health. We have to invest in our people. And we have to think global. We have to think that these diseases I am talking about have no borders. We have to think that the global change has no borders. And it's the reason why I strongly believe in the usefulness of international organizations and the multilateral approach.
Thank you. Jason, barriers, how to overcome them?
Well, I think that the most dynamic part of this conversation still is consumer preferences. And here's one way to think about it. So, we're in the trade war. We've taken out the couch cushions. We're trying to dig up money wherever we can to help mitigate some of the the damages. And we've scraped together $12 billion and now $16 billion. And we're sending that out in the countryside. That just pales into the comparison of the wallet of the consumer. The value at the farm gate of total U.S. ag production is probably, $600 billion, right? So that influencing the big term in the equation, what the consumers pay, I think is the way to have a broader effect across production systems and habits. Now, there's certainly a role for leaders in private sector, in institutions, in government, to promote research, to extend information, to communicate the costs and the benefits of various approaches. There's certainly, I think, important work being done in certification and registration of practices that are valued by consumers. And so I think two things. To affect the marketplace decisions, it's really how do we advance consumer perceptions in a way that the things that we considered are virtuous are valued in the market. And I also believe that the politics will follow the consumers. As the voice and the demand for more of these practices becomes louder, then you will have much more of a momentum to have policy changes to reflect that more organically. So I think that's where the priority should be.
Thank you. Tom, overcoming barriers?
Yeah, just in the interest of time, I'm going to provide one suggestion.
Please.
And that is that our regulatory systems, both in the U.S. and in other governments and in international organizations, be reformed so that they can keep pace with the pace of change. Our regulatory systems are designed, from my view, oftentimes to avoid accountability instead of trying to get results that can send the signals that Jason's talking about to the marketplace and to consumers. We take far too long to make decisions about technologies and techniques that could potentially create more sustainable practices and the sharing of those practices. So I think there should be a major effort to streamline the process without sacrificing the quality. Data can certainly derive a lot of that if it's accumulated and analyzed quickly. But right now, it takes literally years for new technologies to get in place at a time when we don't have years to waste.
Thank you. Marcelo, thoughts on barriers and how to overcome them?
Nosotros creemos que si queremos avanzar en el concepto de romper barreras, sería principalmente que los actores se sientan cómodos a la hora de hablar de sostenibilidad y no se sientan principalmente afectados.
We believe that if we want to knock down barriers from now on, I think that we have to make all the players feel comfortable to talk about everything so they won't feel threatened.
Y nuevamente estos factores deben ser tomados al mismo tiempo y pensando y programando los negocios sustentables más allá de una década, de 2 décadas, pensando ya en un futuro, porque ahí es donde nos damos cuenta de la importancia de tener un buen sistema de negociación.
And then we have to think ahead. We have to think about like not only the next coming 10 years or 20 years. We have to have an action plan. We have to have a good system for us to be able to be sustainable.
También desde la parte de las negociaciones siempre es importante colocar al productor como un actor fundamental que pone en práctica lo que tal vez el consumidor está buscando, tal vez lo que el gobierno está buscando, y depende prácticamente todo el peso sobre él. Y muchas veces vemos a los productores totalmente cerrados a escuchar estas ideas porque no nos damos cuenta que estamos poniendo todo el peso sobre ellos.
And I think that before negotiating anything, we should keep in mind our farmers all the time. We have to keep the farmers in mind because sometimes farmers are already doing what we want them to do, and the consumer doesn't know, and the government doesn't even know that the farmers are already there. So sometimes farmers are not that open to start with new ideas or new discussions because of that lack of information.
Entonces la principal opción que tenemos es la de colocar a todos los actores, colocar estos temas ya en una mesa donde estemos todos sentados y hacerle entender al productor, al industrial de la parte frigorífica, al gobierno, a la sociedad, de que todos tenemos que hacernos responsables en lo que es posible para que los negocios puedan ser sustentables y puedan darnos beneficio por muchos años.
And we all have to sit together on the table, same table, and we have to invite the farmers, the producers, the people that work in refrigeration, everybody, the government, everybody should be also responsible and accountable, so all of us could be part of the new sustainable age.
Thank you. Ma Xuan, last thoughts on barriers and overcoming them.
Okay. Yeah, I think there are 2 points as the barrier for the imbalance. The first one, I think, is communication. And I feel it's still a lack of the dialogue internationally or even in the one country in the industry and the other industry like the multi-stakeholders. So it's not enough to understand each other. So you cannot. It's difficult to form the consensus. And second one is the conflict. And the conflict between the long-term program and the short-term plan is usually to make the very short vision to get the benefit the present time, but ignore the long-term program. So I think we should improve the more opportunity for the dialogue, for the message exchange, and for the deep and broader dialogue. To understand each other better. And second one is to try to make it match up of the long-term vision and the short-term plan, and also the UN agenda and the individual nations policy. I think we should make it very harmony in one system. Yeah.
Thanks very much. We have time for maybe one question here from the audience, if we keep our responses brief. So the question is, are input subsidies and trade restrictions necessary in order to achieve or maintain sustainable production? Anyone want to take a crack at that one? I'm happy to call on someone if no one volunteers.
Yeah, I feel like you're goading me. Like those are the worst things we can do, right? The input subsidies, we start encouraging producers to favor one form of production over another, and so many of our environmental problems are exactly because we have subsidized inputs in the past, right? Trade restrictions, the Swiss, they wanted to keep our asparagus out because we were sending it on airplanes, and that was not sustainable. It was also very protectionist because we competed with them. So I think those are very blunt instruments with huge costs associated with them, and I'm not sure they are sustainable politically or economically. So I'm against.
Others? care to weigh in on that question?
I think a more effective way isn't necessarily to subsidize inputs, but to create new revenue opportunities that farmers and producers and landowners could use that would advance sustainable practices. I mean, I think it is unfair for us to require farmers to do all the heavy lifting and not provide some degree of compensation, and the best way to do that is by figuring out ways in which if they do certain land practices, they're supported. If they create products, waste products, and convert them into something that creates a new business opportunity, they should be benefited from that. I think that's a more effective way than trade restrictions and input subsidies.
Okay. Others care to weigh in?
Nosotros tenemos una iniciativa que está dando ciertos resultados, que es la de que el sector financiero se identifique con los fondos o los programas que nosotros le llamamos los programas verdes. Aquel productor que cumple con lo estipulado por el gobierno tiene mejoría en los créditos y en los sistemas financieros. Entonces, eso también está dando que hablar hoy. Si uno hace bien, tiene que tener algún beneficio extra y no solamente una carga.
Well, in our country, we have some incentives right now because we're working with the financial sector. So farmers that are more sustainable or working correctly, they'll get a better rate for their loans or get better loans. So we are awarding people who are doing the right thing, so they get the benefits that way.
Jean-Philippe, please.
Yes, I would like to say that instead of giving subsidies to every farmer or every exporter, you will have more value for money if you invest in public good, globally. If you invest in science, in the Kansas University, which is generously hosting us today, in the best professors, supporting students, allowing them to listen to our debates, which is a very good initiative. If you invest in GASL to promote open dialogue between the different stakeholders, invest in public-private partnership, invest in dialogue, and invest in better understanding and compromise also in investing in international organizations like FAO or OIE.
Thank you. Mashwang?
Yeah, I think it could be a periodically strategy. I told you that we are trying to build up a comprehensive production chain and the value chain, supply chain, something like that. So when we need something and maybe the subsidize for the import is necessary periodically. But finally, I agree with others that we should have the effective solution beyond that, like the investment to our own research and development, and trying to promote all these application technologies to the production chain, something like that. So, I think it's all right.
Fair enough. Gentlemen, thanks so much for a stimulating conversation. Speaking for myself, I have a lot more knowledge and insight right now than I did 90 minutes ago. It's a complex, challenging question, and we're grateful for your insight. So let's show them our appreciation. Thank you.